The sun was setting on a peaceful Thursday evening as Michelle Thompson drove her white Range Rover through the tree-lined streets of Pine Valley. She had just wrapped up another successful day at her law firm, where she'd spent the past 8 years building her reputation as one of the city's most respected corporate attorneys. The autumn leaves danced across her windshield as she hummed along to her favorite jazz playlist, thinking about the home-cooked dinner waiting for her. Michelle always took this route home. It was quieter than the highway and gave her time to decompress after long hours of client meetings and court appearances. She bought her house in this upscale neighborhood 3 years ago, and the peaceful drive through these familiar streets had become her daily ritual. Today, though, something felt different. In her rearview mirror, she noticed a police cruiser that had been following her for the past few blocks. At first, she didn't think much of it. She was driving exactly at the speed limit. Her vehicle registration was up to date, and she hadn't broken any traffic rules. But as the cruiser stayed close behind her, an uncomfortably familiar feeling began to creep in. Michelle took a deep breath and reminded herself to stay calm. She'd been in situations like this before, and she knew exactly how to handle them. As a successful attorney, she'd learned to navigate these moments with grace and professionalism, even when they made her heart race and her palms sweat. The blue and red lights finally flashed in her mirror. Michelle signaled and pulled over smoothly, positioning her car properly at the curb. She reached for her purse slowly and placed her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, just as her parents had taught her years ago. The setting sun cast long shadows across her dashboard as she waited, her law degree from Harvard hanging proudly from her rearview mirror. Through her side mirror, Michelle watched the officer approach. He was moving with an unusual tension in his stride, his right hand hovering near his holster. She could see him scanning her vehicle, his eyes lingering on the luxury car's emblem and the professional attire she wore. The contrast between his suspicious approach and her everyday reality wasn't lost on her. Michelle kept her breathing steady, remembering the countless times she'd advised her own clients about staying composed during police interactions. She reached up carefully to turn on her interior light, making sure the officer could see clearly into her vehicle. Her dashboard camera, a gift from her husband, blinked quietly in the corner of her windshield. The whole scene felt surreal. Here she was, less than a mile from her own home, being treated like an intruder in her own neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on her that just hours ago, she'd been in court, defending a major corporation's interests, and now she was being viewed with suspicion on her own street. As the officer's footsteps grew closer, Michelle began mentally recording every detail of the interaction, her legal training kicking in automatically. She knew this stop wasn't about any traffic violation. She'd been driving perfectly. The question was, how would she handle what was coming next? Her phone buzzed quietly in its holder, probably her husband wondering why she wasn't home yet. Michelle resisted the urge to check it, keeping her hands firmly on the wheel. She'd learned long ago that in moments like these, every movement mattered, every decision counted. The sun had almost completely set now, and the streetlights were beginning to flicker on, casting an artificial glow over the scene. Michelle could feel her heart beating steadily in her chest, not from fear, but from a deep, familiar determination. Whatever was about to happen, she was prepared to handle it with the same grace and intelligence that had carried her through law school, through the bar exam, and through countless courtroom battles. This wasn't just another traffic stop. It was about to become a moment of truth, a test of character, and perhaps an opportunity for change. As the officer's shadow fell across her window, Michelle straightened her spine and prepared herself for what was to come, knowing that sometimes the most important lessons happen in the most unexpected places. The familiar crunch of gravel under boots grew louder as the officer finally reached her window. Michelle kept her eyes forward, her expression neutral but confident. Years of experience had taught her that what happened in the next few moments would set the tone for the entire encounter. She was ready, not just as a lawyer, but as someone who understood that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. Little did the approaching officer know that this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine, and the lessons learned tonight would echo far beyond this quiet suburban street. The officer tapped on Michelle's window with his flashlight, the beam casting harsh shadows across her face. She pressed the button to lower her window, maintaining her composed demeanor despite the officer's intimidating stance. The name on his badge read Officer Wilson, though he made no effort to introduce himself. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone sharp and accusatory. The absence of any greeting or explanation for the stop didn't go unnoticed by Michelle, who had handled hundreds of legal cases involving traffic stops. She reached slowly for her documents, narrating her movements in a clear, steady voice. "I'm reaching for my license in my purse and my registration from the glove compartment, officer," she said, her voice professional and calm. The lawyer in her knew the importance of creating a verbal record, especially since her dashboard camera was capturing everything. Officer Wilson's flashlight beam followed her every move, the tension in his posture evident. "You seem to be in quite a hurry to get somewhere," he said, though Michelle had been driving exactly at the speed limit. "This is a nice car for this neighborhood. Is it yours?" The implication in his question made Michelle's stomach tighten, but her face remained neutral. "Yes, officer, this is my vehicle. I live in this neighborhood, just a few blocks from here." She handed over her license and registration, documents that clearly showed her local address. The officer studied her license with exaggerated scrutiny, glancing between the photo and her face multiple times. "You live in Pine Valley Estates." His disbelief was barely concealed. "What exactly do you do for a living, ma'am?" Michelle had faced this type of questioning before, the kind that had nothing to do with traffic safety and everything to do with assumptions. "I'm a corporate attorney with Anderson and Mitchell Law Firm downtown," she replied, her voice steady despite the growing discomfort of the situation. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Officer Wilson suddenly demanded, his hand moving to rest on his holster. "I smell something suspicious." Michelle knew there was nothing to smell. She didn't even allow smoking in her car. Her heart rate quickened, but her mind remained sharp. She reached for her phone, making sure it was recording. "Officer Wilson, I've complied with your requests for documentation, but I haven't been informed of the reason for this stop. Could you please state the traffic violation you observed?" Her question seemed to irritate him further. "Ma'am, when an officer gives you an order, you comply first and ask questions later. Step out of the vehicle now." His voice had taken on an edge that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Michelle knew her rights, but she also knew the delicate balance required in these situations. "Officer, I want to comply with your lawful orders, but I also have the right to know why I'm being stopped and now asked to exit my vehicle. Could you please call a supervisor to the scene?" The dashcam continued to blink silently as Officer Wilson's face hardened. "You lawyers think you know everything, don't you?" he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "I don't need a supervisor to do my job. Last time I'm asking, step out of the vehicle." Michelle's mind raced through her options. As a lawyer, she knew her rights inside and out. As a black woman being pulled over at dusk, she knew the reality of her situation. She kept her phone recording as she carefully reached for her seatbelt, maintaining eye contact with the officer through her side mirror. Just then, another set of headlights appeared in her rearview mirror. A dark SUV pulled up behind the police cruiser, its headlights illuminating the entire scene. Officer Wilson turned slightly, his attention divided between Michelle and the new arrival. Michelle caught a glimpse of a familiar vehicle in her mirror, and for the first time since being pulled over, she felt her shoulders relax slightly. She knew those headlights, knew that vehicle, and most importantly, knew its driver. What Officer Wilson didn't know was that his routine traffic stop was about to become a profound lesson in prejudice and professionalism. The tension in the air shifted as a car door opened and closed behind them. Officer Wilson's flashlight beam wavered slightly as footsteps approached, firm, measured steps that spoke of authority and purpose. Michelle remained still, her hands visible on the steering wheel, knowing that the next few moments would change the entire dynamic of this encounter. The hidden blessing of this situation wasn't lost on Michelle. Sometimes, she thought, the most powerful lessons come disguised as ordinary moments, and this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. As her husband's footsteps grew closer, she prepared herself for what would happen next, knowing that this encounter could become a catalyst for real change. The evening air had grown cooler as Officer Wilson's demeanor became increasingly hostile. Michelle's phone continued recording as the situation spiraled into something far beyond a simple traffic stop. Her years of legal experience told her that everything about this stop was wrong, from the lack of probable cause to the officer's aggressive stance. "I won't ask again," Officer Wilson barked, his hand now fully resting on his holster. "Exit the vehicle now." The streetlights cast strange shadows across his face, making his expression seem even more menacing. Michelle took a slow, deliberate breath. "Officer Wilson," she began, her voice clear and steady despite her racing heart. "I'm happy to comply with lawful orders, but I need you to understand that I'm recording this interaction for both our safety." She held up her phone, making sure it was visible but not threatening. The officer's face twisted with anger. "Recording won't help you here. This is about compliance, and right now, you're bordering on obstruction." His words carried a threat that hung heavy in the air. Michelle's legal training kicked in full force. "Officer, with all due respect, I have the right to record this interaction. I also have the right to know why I'm being stopped and why you're asking me to exit my vehicle when I've shown you my license and registration proving I live in this neighborhood." Her dashboard camera caught everything: the way Officer Wilson's jaw clenched, how his fingers tapped against his holster, the slight shake in his flashlight beam as his frustration grew. The whole scene was being documented, and somehow that seemed to make him even angrier. "You people always want to make things difficult," he spat out, the words carrying years of prejudice. "I smell something suspicious in your vehicle, and that gives me probable cause. Now, are you going to comply, or do we need to escalate this situation?" Michelle's voice remained steady as she responded, "Officer, I need to point out that smelling something suspicious is not specific probable cause, and my rights under the Fourth Amendment protect me from unreasonable search and seizure. I'm requesting again that you call a supervisor to the scene." The tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. Officer Wilson took a step closer to her window, his body language becoming more aggressive. "Your fancy law degree doesn't change the fact that I'm the one with the badge here. Last warning, step out of the vehicle or I'll have to remove you myself." Michelle's heart pounded, but her mind remained clear. She pressed the emergency alert on her phone's safety app, a feature her husband had insisted she install. She knew help was already on the way, but she needed to keep the situation from escalating for just a few more minutes. "I want to comply with lawful orders, Officer Wilson," she said, her voice remaining professional despite the fear creeping up her spine. "But I also need to ensure my rights are protected. Everything you're saying and doing is being recorded, and I'm concerned about your approach to this stop." The officer's radio crackled, breaking the tension momentarily. He ignored it, his focus entirely on Michelle. "Recording or not, you're about to learn a lesson about respecting authority," he said, reaching for his radio to call for backup. What Officer Wilson didn't realize was that the most important backup had already arrived. Behind him, another car door opened and closed, footsteps approaching with purpose. The atmosphere shifted subtly as a new presence entered the scene, one that would transform this confrontation into something entirely unexpected. Michelle could see it in her rearview mirror. Her husband's tall figure approaching, his FBI credentials catching the streetlight. She maintained her composed demeanor, knowing that the next few moments would be crucial. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about to become a teachable moment that could impact countless future interactions. The night air seemed to hold its breath as the footsteps grew closer. Officer Wilson was so focused on his perceived authority over Michelle that he hadn't yet registered the approaching figure. The dashboard camera continued its silent witness as the situation teetered on the edge of transformation. This moment, Michelle realized, was bigger than just one traffic stop. It was about to become a lesson in accountability, professionalism, and the proper use of authority. As her husband's footsteps drew nearer, she steeled herself for what was about to unfold, a confrontation that would challenge prejudices and potentially change minds, one small step at a time. The tension in the air shifted as Michelle's husband, David Thompson, approached the scene with measured steps. His FBI credentials hung clearly visible around his neck, catching the glow of the streetlights. He'd been tracking Michelle's location through their family safety app, growing concerned when she hadn't arrived home at her usual time. Officer Wilson remained focused on Michelle, unaware of the approaching federal agent. "I'm calling for backup," he announced, reaching for his radio. "And then we're going to." "Good evening, officer," David's deep, professional voice cut through the night air. His tone was calm but carried unmistakable authority. "I believe I can be of assistance here." Officer Wilson spun around, his flashlight beam swinging wildly before settling on David's face. The sight of the FBI credentials made him take an involuntary step back. "Sir, this is a routine traffic stop. I have everything under control." David nodded thoughtfully, maintaining his composed demeanor. "I understand, Officer Wilson," he said, having read the name badge. "I'm Special Agent Thompson with the FBI, and the woman you've pulled over is my wife. Would you mind explaining the reason for this stop?" The color drained from Officer Wilson's face as he processed this new information. His hand, which had been resting on his holster, slowly moved away. I observed suspicious behavior," he stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. "Suspicious behavior?" David echoed, his eyebrows raising slightly. "Could you be more specific? What exactly did you observe?" His questions weren't confrontational, but they carried the weight of professional scrutiny. Michelle remained in her car, continuing to record the interaction. She watched through her mirror as her husband masterfully handled the situation, his years of federal law enforcement experience evident in every word and gesture. "The vehicle seemed out of place in this neighborhood," Officer Wilson admitted, his voice losing its earlier edge. "And when I approached, I thought I smelled something suspicious." David glanced at his wife's immaculate Range Rover, then back at the officer. "Out of place," he repeated quietly. "Officer Wilson, we live 3 blocks from here. This is our neighborhood." He paused, letting that information sink in. "And regarding the smell, I'd be interested to know what exactly you thought you smelled in my wife's vehicle." The night air felt heavy with unspoken implications. Officer Wilson shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very aware of how his actions might look to an FBI agent. The dashboard camera continued its silent recording as the power dynamic of the situation completely reversed. "Perhaps," David suggested gently, "we should take a moment to discuss proper traffic stop procedures. As law enforcement professionals, we have a responsibility to serve our community without bias." His voice remained respectful, showing no hint of the anger he surely felt. A police radio crackled in the background, its static cutting through the tense silence. Officer Wilson's backup would arrive soon, but this situation had already transformed into something very different from what he'd expected. Michelle watched as her husband took a step closer to Officer Wilson, speaking in a lower voice that she could barely hear. The 2 men stood in the glow of the cruiser's lights, one local and one federal, both sworn to protect and serve, but with very different approaches to that duty. Other residents began to notice the scene, some slowing their cars as they drove past, others peering out their windows at the unusual gathering of vehicles. This quiet suburban street had become the stage for a crucial lesson in law enforcement accountability. David's presence had changed everything, not through intimidation or confrontation, but through professional authority and measured response. He stood as a bridge between 2 worlds, the law enforcement community he served and the reality of being a black family in an upscale neighborhood. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder as Officer Wilson's backup neared the scene. David remained perfectly calm, knowing that what happened next would be crucial. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. It was about setting an example of how law enforcement should handle every interaction. Michelle felt a mix of emotions as she watched the scene unfold. Pride in her husband's professionalism, lingering anger at the initial treatment she'd received, and hope that this encounter might lead to real change. The dashboard camera caught every moment, creating a record that could potentially help train other officers in the future. This unexpected meeting of local and federal law enforcement was about to become more than just an interrupted traffic stop. It was transforming into a moment of education, understanding, and potentially lasting change in how officers approach their duties in the community. The backup patrol car pulled up just as David was about to speak again. Its headlights added to the growing circle of lights surrounding the scene, creating an almost theatrical setting for what was about to unfold. 2 more officers stepped out, approaching cautiously as they assessed the situation. "Evening, gentlemen," David greeted the arriving officers, his FBI credentials still visible in the glare of multiple headlights. "I'm Special Agent Thompson. Officer Wilson and I were just about to have an important discussion about traffic stop protocols." The new officers exchanged glances, quickly picking up on the tension in the air. The senior of the two, a sergeant with graying hair at his temples, stepped forward. "I'm Sergeant Chen. What seems to be the situation here?" David gestured toward Michelle's car with a calm sweep of his hand. "My wife was pulled over while driving home through our neighborhood. Officer Wilson hasn't yet provided a valid reason for the stop, though he's mentioned the vehicle seemed out of place and he thought he smelled something suspicious." Sergeant Chen's expression shifted slightly as he processed this information. He was a veteran officer who had seen enough to understand the implications. "Officer Wilson, could you explain your probable cause for this stop?" Officer Wilson's earlier bravado had completely disappeared. I observed the vehicle moving slowly through the neighborhood," he started, but David quietly interrupted. "At exactly the speed limit, according to my wife's dashboard camera," David noted, "which, by the way, has been recording this entire interaction." His voice remained professional, but there was an edge of steel beneath the courtesy. The night air grew heavier as David continued. "Let's break this down professionally, shall we? First, there was no traffic violation. Second, the assumption that a luxury vehicle was out of place in an upscale neighborhood suggests some concerning biases. Third, the escalation to demands for vehicle exit without probable cause violates several departmental procedures." Michelle watched through her window as her husband masterfully controlled the conversation. He wasn't angry or confrontational. Instead, he was turning this into a teaching moment, speaking as one law enforcement professional to another. "Gentlemen," David addressed all three officers, "we have an opportunity here. This situation could have ended very differently if I hadn't arrived when I did. As someone who spent 15 years in federal law enforcement, I can tell you that these kinds of interactions damage community trust and make all our jobs harder." Sergeant Chen nodded slowly, his experience showing in his thoughtful expression. "Agent Thompson, I appreciate you handling this professionally. Officer Wilson is fairly new to our force, and this could be a valuable learning experience." The dashboard camera continued recording as David pulled out his phone. "I have some statistics I'd like to share with you," he said, scrolling through his files. "Our bureau has been tracking traffic stop patterns across multiple jurisdictions. The data shows some troubling trends that we need to address." Officer Wilson shifted uncomfortably as David shared the numbers, clear evidence of discriminatory patterns in traffic stops across the country. The other officers listened intently, their expressions growing more serious with each statistic. "The thing is," David continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone, "this isn't just about numbers, it's about real people. My wife is a corporate attorney who drives this route every day. Today, she was treated like a criminal in her own neighborhood, and that's something we need to discuss." Michelle noticed how David's words were affecting each officer differently. Sergeant Chen was nodding thoughtfully, while the other backup officer looked embarrassed. Officer Wilson stood rigid, his face a mix of shame and defensiveness. "I'm not here to file a complaint," David assured them, though everyone knew he had every right to do so. "I'm here to help ensure this becomes a learning opportunity. What happened here tonight is a perfect example of how implicit biases can lead to improper police actions." The streetlights cast long shadows as David pulled out his business card. "I conduct training sessions at the FBI Academy about community relations and unbiased policing. I'd be happy to arrange something similar for your department." His offer was genuine, turning a potentially confrontational situation into an opportunity for growth. This was the kind of moment that could change things, not through anger or accusations, but through professional dialogue and education. As the officers absorbed David's words, the night air seemed to hold the promise of positive change, one small interaction at a time. David's voice carried through the cool night air as he turned this tense situation into something meaningful. "Let me share a personal story with you," he began, his tone warm but professional. 10 years ago, before I joined the FBI, I was pulled over 3 times in 1 week driving through my own neighborhood. Each time, the officer couldn't give me a valid reason for the stop. Officer Wilson's eyes widened slightly as he listened. The other officers gathered closer, drawn in by David's story. Michelle remained in her car, still recording, but she could see the impact her husband's words were having on everyone present. "The thing is," David continued, pulling up some data on his phone, "these aren't isolated incidents. Look at these numbers. He showed them statistics from recent studies. In our city alone, minority drivers are 4 times more likely to be pulled over for suspicious behavior than white drivers in the same neighborhoods. Sergeant Chen leaned in to look at the figures, his expression growing more concerned. These numbers are troubling, he admitted, running a hand through his graying hair. But here's what's interesting, David said, scrolling to another screen. When departments implement comprehensive bias training and community engagement programs, these numbers drop dramatically. And guess what else drops? Complaints against officers, tension with the community. Even crime rates go down because people start trusting law enforcement again. The young backup officer spoke up for the first time. How do we start making those changes? He asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. David smiled warmly. That's exactly the right question. It starts with moments like this, recognizing when our actions might be influenced by unconscious bias. Let's break down what happened tonight. He turned to Officer Wilson, who had been quiet for a while. You saw a luxury vehicle in an upscale neighborhood and made assumptions. But think about it, what made those assumptions kick in? Was it really suspicious behavior, or was it something else? Officer Wilson shifted uncomfortably but maintained eye contact. I guess I didn't expect. He trailed off, realizing how his next words would sound. You didn't expect to see someone who looks like my wife driving that car in this neighborhood, David finished gently. That's what implicit bias looks like. It's not about being a bad person. It's about recognizing these automatic thoughts and learning to question them. Michelle watched through her window as understanding slowly dawned on Officer Wilson's face. This wasn't the harsh reprimand he probably expected. Instead, it was becoming a moment of real learning. You know what makes a great officer? David asked, looking at each of them in turn. The ability to learn and grow from every interaction, to question our own assumptions, to remember that behind every traffic stop is a human being with a story. He pulled out more data on his phone. Look at these success stories, departments that have implemented bias training and community engagement programs. Notice how their community relations improved, how their officers reported feeling more satisfied with their jobs. The night had grown quieter, as if the universe itself was listening to this impromptu lesson. Even the occasional passing car seemed to slow down, sensing the importance of what was happening. Here's what I propose, David said, reaching into his pocket for his business cards. I conduct training sessions at the FBI Academy about community relations and unbiased policing. I'd be happy to work with your department, not as punishment, but as an opportunity for growth. Sergeant Chen took a card, nodding thoughtfully. This could be valuable for our entire force, he said, especially our younger officers. And here's something else to consider, David added, his voice taking on a more personal tone. Every interaction like this one ripples out into the community. When people feel unfairly targeted, they tell their friends, their families. But when they have positive interactions with law enforcement, they share those stories too. He gestured toward Michelle's car. My wife is a respected attorney. She works with the community. Think about how this story could have spread if it had ended differently. Instead, now we have an opportunity to turn it into something positive. The dashboard camera kept recording as David continued his impromptu training session, turning what could have been a confrontational moment into one of understanding and growth. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. It was about changing perspectives, one officer at a time. 3 months after that fateful traffic stop, the local police department's training room was packed with officers, both rookie and veteran, all eyes focused on the front of the room. David stood there, presenting dashcam footage from that night, using it as a teaching tool for better community relations. What you're watching isn't just about one traffic stop, he explained, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. It's about the hundreds of similar interactions that happen every day across our country. The difference is, we have a chance to learn from this one. Officer Wilson sat in the front row, a changed man from that night. The incident had sparked something in him, not shame or resentment, but a genuine desire to improve. He'd volunteered to share his perspective with his fellow officers, turning his mistake into a valuable lesson for others. I thought I was doing my job, Officer Wilson admitted to his colleagues, standing up beside David. But what I was really doing was letting unconscious bias guide my actions. Thanks to Agent Thompson's intervention, I learned to question those automatic assumptions. The department had embraced change in the months following the incident. Sergeant Chen had worked with David to implement new training programs, focusing on community engagement and bias awareness. The results were already showing in the department's statistics. Michelle had also become part of the change. She now regularly spoke at police academy sessions, sharing her perspective as both a legal professional and a community member. Her story helped new officers understand the impact their actions could have on the people they served. Traffic stops dropped by 23% in our neighborhood, David showed on his presentation slides. But more importantly, community trust has increased. People are more willing to work with law enforcement because they feel respected and heard. The dashcam footage from that night had become a powerful training tool. Officers watched as David turned what could have been a confrontational situation into a teaching moment. They saw how professional dialogue could bridge gaps and create understanding. Local news had picked up the story not as a scandal, but as an example of positive change in law enforcement. Other departments began reaching out, interested in implementing similar training programs. What started as one incident was spreading, creating ripples of change throughout the law enforcement community. The key is understanding that we're all human, David explained to the room full of officers. We all have biases, but what matters is how we recognize and address them. Every traffic stop, every interaction is an opportunity to either build or break trust with our community. The training room buzzed with discussion as officers shared their own experiences and insights. Veterans talked about how policing had changed over the years, while younger officers asked questions about handling difficult situations. The atmosphere was open, honest, and focused on growth. Officer Wilson had become an unexpected advocate for change within the department. His willingness to learn from his mistake had earned him respect from both his fellow officers and the community. He now helped train new officers, using his experience to show the importance of unbiased policing. Michelle's law firm had taken notice too. They'd started a pro bono program to work with the police department on community relations. What began as a tense traffic stop had evolved into a partnership between law enforcement and legal professionals, all working toward positive change. The dashboard camera footage ended, and David clicked to his final slide. "This isn't just about following procedures," he said, looking around the room. "It's about remembering that behind every traffic stop is a human being, someone's parent, child, spouse, or friend. When we approach each interaction with respect and professionalism, we make our communities safer for everyone." As the training session wrapped up, officers lingered to talk with David and Officer Wilson. The energy in the room was hopeful. These weren't just cops attending a required training, they were professionals eager to improve their service to the community. Outside the police station, life went on as usual. But something had changed in this small corner of the world. One traffic stop, handled with professionalism and turned into a teaching moment, had sparked a transformation that continued to grow, one interaction at a time.